All right, welcome everyone to the great debates, the great D's of, we're calling this little mini-series of Ashkenaz Jewry. We're going to start, as was requested by our sponsor for this evening, with Rabbeinu Gershom. And we want to thank Stuart and Nora for sponsoring tonight's share in honor of Stuart's full recovery from COVID-19 and the miracle that Nora did not contract the virus. Baruch Hashem a million times, and you should both only know from Health and Happiness, Ad Mea Ve'esrim, where you can continue to support Torah in this way. Yasher Koach to you both. And also sponsored by the Abraham family, to wish a mazel tov to Mickey and Rachel Abraham in honor of their 5th wedding anniversary. Mazel tov. The series, this mini-series we're going to be doing is a series where we are going to discuss the development of halacha for Ashkenaz Jews. And in order to do so, it really begins with Rabbeinu Gershom. Now, who was Rabbeinu Gershom? Who was this individual? We know when he lived was the early, he lived from the middle of the 10th century to the middle of the 11th century, from 960 to 1040. He lived a relatively long life for the time. He had difficulties in his life. He had a son who, Rahman al-Islam, converted to Christianity. Imagine the pressures of the time of a Jew living in a Christian land in the 10th and 11th century was very, very pressurized. And we'll talk about some major institutions that and installments that Rabbeinu Gershom established, in order to help combat the emotional side of, a Jew that is dealing with that. But he had a son that converted to Christianity, and in fact, when his son died, Rabbeinu Gershom sat shiva twice. He sat shiva for 14 days, once for his guf and once for his neshama, once for his physical body and one for his neshama. He sat shiva for 14 days. So Rabbeinu Gershom did not have an easy life, but he had a revolutionary life. He had a profound life, and a life that we are still learning from and still practicing the teachings that he taught. Rabbeinu Gershom. First of all, let's just start right there with that title of Rabbeinu. Rabbeinu is not given to everyone. Not given to every rabbi. There are some people who have been given the title of Rabbeinu, where we give kind of like, just to give honor. Let's say I refer to Rabbi Shechter, my Rebbe, as Moreinu v'Rabbeinu, our master and our rabbi. But when an individual receives the accolade of Rabbeinu from all of Klal Yisrael, and it's part of their title, that is something significant. We know Moshe Rabbeinu received such a title. Rabbeinu Gershom receives such a title, but he has an additional title that he doesn't just have his prefix of Rabbeinu, but he also has a suffix of Me'or Hagola, the light of the exile. His nickname is so telling to who he was, that he was the light while the Jews were experiencing that kind of a heavy exile, living in Europe amongst Christian lands. As we mentioned, he lived from 960 to 1040. He was born in Metz in northeast France. Later, he went to Mainz, and he was a Rosh Yeshiva there. He had a yeshiva there, not a yeshiva like, with the numbers that exist in the Mir, Lakewood, or Yeshiva University. Small yeshiva from him. The students that he taught ended up being the teachers of Rashi. And Rashi actually was born the same year that Rabbeinu Gershom passed away. Rabbeinu Gershom passed away in 1040. Interestingly enough, that Rashi was born the same year, as the pasuk says, Zar Hashemesh Uva Hashemesh. That when the sun sets, then the sun rises. And when Rabbeinu Gershom set, when the Ma'or Hagola went out, when that light was extinguished, so we were blessed that Rashi took on and continued in the same mission of Rabbeinu Gershom, where Rabbeinu Gershom, we're going to learn, tried to make Judaism and halacha something that, despite the challenges of the times that they were living in, something that was daracheha darchei noam, something of pleasantry, something that was approachable, something that was accessible to the masses. In order for us to really appreciate what Rabbeinu Gershom did practically, we really have to take a step back and understand exactly how the system of halacha works in general. And this is something that we've discussed in the past, of what exactly the system of halacha is, but it's good to review it in this context. So very briefly, the way that halacha, or the way that the halachic system was developed, was as follows. We know that in the year 2448, we received the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu went up onto Har Sinai. He learned the entire Torah with God. God reveals himself to the nation. He says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher tzitzicha me'eretz Mitzrayim, teaches us the mitzvah of emunah. Moshe Rabbeinu goes on to teach all of Klal Yisrael, the 613 mitzvot. It's a question as to whether or not he taught it at all 613 mitzvot at that moment, and then reviewed it as they were going throughout their journey in the wilderness, or it was that he taught it in piecemeal. He didn't teach it all in one shot, taught it in piecemeal. The Gemara in Chagiga and in Gittin has a discussion about that. But anyway, we know that we received all 613 mitzvot, plus the principles of how to perform those mitzvos, all at Har Sinai. Now, all of those details that were taught, and there's a lot of them, do not make up the bulk of what is contained within Shas. The bulk of what is discussed in the Svarim that we have in our Jewish libraries is not all what was taught by Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai or during the time in the wilderness. Rather, halacha developed over time, and God set that up by design, where God purposely made a Torah that was vague, with a set of rules and regulations on how to expound, how to elucidate the Torah that was given. So he has a written Torah, and he has the 613 mitzvot that are in that written Torah, in oral tradition, to practice those 613 mitzvot. But there are many other things that are not exactly clear and concise. I'll give you an example. For example, I wear tcheles, okay? So the way that you are supposed to wrap your tzitzis, you see that there are a number of different customs, a number of different ways to do it. And even specifically by tcheles, there's something like 10 or 15 different ways you're supposed to wrap your tcheles around with your lavan, with your white strings. And we know that this applies to so many different practices in Jewish law. There are so many different ways to do it. Now, how did all of that come to be? So the Rambam says the following. The Rambam writes in an introduction to the Perush HaRambam of the Mishnahos, the Perush Mishnahos, the explanation and elucidation of the Mishnah, which is the collection that Rabbi Yehuda Anasi made. Rabbi Yehuda Anasi's Yortzeit was this week, that Rabbi Yehuda Anasi put together. Judah the Prince in the beginning of the 3rd century, where he collected all of the oral traditions and different opinions regarding, sometimes different opinions regarding how to perform certain mitzvos and the like. He collected all of that, and what the Rambam did is that he expounded that with the explanations from the Gemara, the Halacha, etc. And he wrote it in Arabic in order so that it was something that was, approachable by the common Jew living in Arab countries at the time. And he writes in the introduction to that work a beautiful summary of the history of halacha. And he says that you can break down our old tradition into 5 separate categories. Those 5 separate categories are: number 1, Perushim Mikubalim, the most generally accepted ways to understand the pasuk. And what that means, and for example, the Rambam says, what a lulav and esrog look like. What is a lulav and esrog? I'm sorry. What, the fact that we take a lulav and esrog on sukkahs. What does it say in the Torah? It says, that on the first day of Sukkot, you're supposed to take for yourself a a beautiful fruit. Well, what's a beautiful fruit? Right? I happen to think that cantaloupe is a beautiful fruit. I think that honeydew is a beautiful fruit. I think that peaches and plums and pears are beautiful fruits. So why can't I take one of those and fulfill my mitzvah? After all, the Torah says a beautiful fruit. We have a pirush mikubal. We have an accepted understanding of the pasuk. That beautiful fruit means a citron. It means an esrog. Continues the Rambam and he says the second category is halacha l'Moshe Sinai, a law that comes straight from Har Sinai, even when there is no source for it in the Torah, meaning the Torah doesn't even make a mention, a vague mention, a hint to the halacha. Unlike what a beautiful fruit is, the Torah says you have to take a beautiful fruit during Sukkot. So what a beautiful fruit is, that we have an accepted understanding. Halacha l'Moshe Sinai, halacha that comes straight from Har Sinai, that Moshe Rabbeinu taught in how we fulfill mitzvos. Says the Rambam, an example would be the fact that tefillin are black. That all it says in the Torah is ukshartem laos al yadecha v'hayu lototafos beinenacha. You're supposed to bind the Shema on your head and on your arm. What does that mean? It sounds like what it means is that I have to take the Shema in its cloth, in its written form, and literally wrap it on my arm or wrap it on my head. So exactly where it sits on my head, okay, that would be a perish makubal. But the fact that it's black, the Torah doesn't even make a mention of the fact that it has a color, that it has a shape. All of these things are halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Continuing, the Rambam says, number 3, the third area of halacha is drushos. Drushos are elucidations, biblical exegesis, where we explain and we expound the Torah. So we have a written Torah. The written Torah, there is more between the lines than in the lines themselves. There's more between the letters than there are in the words themselves. There is so much behind the Torah that it is an endless sea of elucidation, of explanation, of nuances, of things to learn. And Moshe Rabbeinu gave us a set of rules of how to, and principles of how to expound on the Torah. That is how you could develop so many different opinions. Okay, this is all deoraisa. This is all from the Torah. Even when you have multiple opinions, the Gemara in Eruvin tells us on Daf Yud Gimel, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim, that they are both correct. You could have multiple truths in halacha, because that is exactly what God designed. He designed that there's a system where you can get to a conclusion in 2 different ways, and both of them are completely accurate, and therefore we can treat them both as emes, both as truth, even though they are contradictory. It's a fascinating thing, not for right now. That says the Rambam that there are 2 more categories. The 2 more categories are rabbinic in nature. Number 1, derabbanans. Derabbanans can comprise of gzeros and takanos, rabbinic decrees and enactments. So rabbinic decrees and enactments are things that were established by a Beis Din, where a Beis Din will come together and make a decision because they recognize that there is a potential pitfall that the Jewish people could fall into by simply just following the Torah. And if you just follow the mitzvos and you're very you put it in a box of, well, it says in the Torah that I am not allowed to have meat and milk together. I'm not allowed to have beef and milk together, right? Because it says lo sevashal gedi b'chalevimo, which the Gemara tells us in Chulin. That means that it's the Mishnah tells us at the end of Chulin that means that beef, which is an animal that its mother gives milk, okay, I would not allow to have with milk. What about chicken? So in the supermarket, we consider chicken to be like meat. I mean, it's poultry, but it's meat. And therefore, it would seem like you're allowed to have chicken and milk together. In fact, Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, in their community, Rabbi Yossi HaGlili used to have chicken and meat, chicken and milk together in the town of Rabbi Yossi HaGlili. And in fact, the Gemara in Shabbos says that the townspeople of Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, this is the Gemara in Shabbos and Daf Kuf Lamed, that the townspeople of Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, that they followed their rabbi, and even though the rabbi went against the grain, he was non-conventional, he didn't go with he thought, no, there's nothing wrong with having chicken and milk. And the Gemara says that the people of that town, by eating the chicken and milk, received merit for their act of having their chicken parmesan on Friday night. So here you can have multiple opinions. So you have the rabbis that established the halacha, but it's possible that you have someone like Rabbi Yossi HaGlili that never agreed to that halacha. He never jumped on the bandwagon. And if someone could, trace their roots potentially back to Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, assuming that they did not already accept upon themselves this prohibition of eating chicken and milk, potentially you could come up with a scenario. Potentially they could start having chicken parmesan. I wouldn't recommend it, just because probably at some point along the way one of your ancestors accepted the tradition, but theoretically speaking, something could exist like that. The last category are minhagem. Now, what are minhagem? Minhagem are customs, the way that we practice our Judaism. Not just simply the law, but also practice comes into play. So what I mean over here is, let's say the Torah says, we have to serve God with all of our heart. Says the Gemara in Tainus on Daf Beis, Ezu avoda shebalev, what is serving God with your heart? Zu tefillah. This is prayer. So we know that there's a biblical obligation of prayer. Says the Rambam that this is the source of the biblical obligation, that we need to pray at least once on a daily basis. Good. Came along the rabbis and they established that, well, there is a system to prayer, that you need to have in your prayer praise of God. You have to ask requests from God. You need to be able to thank God. You pray in the morning during this time slot. You pray in the afternoon during this time slot. You pray in the evening during this time slot. The details of the laws of prayer were enacted by the rabbis. That is step number 2 that we spoke about. There's D'oraisa, D'Rabbanan, and then Minhagem. The liturgy of the prayers, that is open to custom. There is the basic form that was established by the rabbis, but the exact language that is used, that's subject to custom. There is the Ashkenaz custom, there's the Sephardic custom, there's the Chabad custom. There, even within the Ashkenaz community, there's a Yeki custom, and there is a Polish custom. In the Hasidic community, there are different customs. There is the Nosach Ari, and there are Nosach Sfard. And then in the Sephardic community, there are different customs. There's Edura Mizrach. There is Syrian. There is Persian. There are so many different liturgies and customs, and that is subject to each person's community and family and a number of different factors. So these are customs. Now, says the Gemara in Nedarim that customs, when accepted upon a person, you treat them as rabbinic law, okay? that is called a neder. That if someone has a minhag tov, that they started practicing a certain way for at least 3 times, so that establishes law, and now you have to do it. It's an institutional reform that you've put upon yourself. Okay? Came along Rabbeinu Gershom, and he said, well, following this system, that there are times where we add on certain halachas in order so that we can give guidance to fulfill ultimately what it says in the Torah of the halachta b'drach, of walking in the ways of God, and in order to represent that the Torah is darchei noam. So it could be that there are new scenarios that are presented to a time that require us to add on new takanos, new charamim, new enactments, new institutional reforms in order to help shape our Jewish society. Came along Rabbeinu Gershom in around the year 1000. So this is he's about 40 years of age at this point, and comes along Rabbeinu Gershom, and he has a whole list of different enactments. Now, his enactments were for the Ashkenaz community. Okay, we're talking about the lands in the Rhinelands, right? We're talking about lands in France and Germany. We're talking about that area of Western Europe, where this is Rabbeinu Gershom's, this is his pulpit, and this is where he's establishing the halacha, and the rabbis of the time agreed to him, and the community accepted these practices upon themselves, these institutions back upon themselves. Some of them are quoted by Rabbi Yosef Karo in the Shulchan Aruch also, because some of them were accepted by the Sephardic community. Rabbeinu Gershom says the Shulchan Aruch in the beginning of Even HaEzer, in the 4th section of his Shulchan Aruch, Ha-cherem al hanosa es ishto, that Rabbeinu Hananel had a cherem regarding marrying two wives. We're going to talk more in detail about his cherems next week, God willing. But he had a few very famous haramim. Of those famous haramim is polygamy. He said that he denounced polygamy from Ashkenazi culture, and this was among his haramim, his enactments. Another was, the Torah says that technically speaking, all one has to do is give a get to their wife if they want to become divorced. Now, it would mean then, says the Gemara, that you'd be able to do that ba'al karcha, you'd be able to do that against her will even, which technically was the halacha until Rabbeinu Gershom came along, and Rabbeinu Gershom said, no more of that. You cannot divorce your wife against her will. It needs to be a mutually agreed upon divorce. Another famous cherem and very important, very practical, probably the most practical in terms of questions that would arise today of Rabbeinu Gershom's takanos, is that Rabbeinu Gershom established a takana: you are not allowed to read the mail of another person, right? Which to us it sounds like, that's called being a upstanding member of society. You can't just go around reading other people's mail. But Rabbeinu Gershom established this as halacha, that this is a halacha of a way to treat other people. It's a cherem upon, let's say, v'yahavta l'reacha kamocha. We're going to talk about that more in depth as well next week. There is a whole list of different haramim. The Shulchan Aruch does not quote all of them because they were established for the Ashkenaz community. So he says now the cherem of, let's say, marrying. So he's talking about over here the cherem of marrying, of having polygamy. So he says v'lo pashta takanasa b'chol haratzos. He says that this was not accepted by by the entire Jewish world. He says that, basically saying that in the Sephardic world, there would be nothing wrong with having 2 wives. I know a friend of mine from yeshiva that his family is from Iran, and his great-grandfather had 2 wives. It was relatively common. In 1948, when the state of Israel was established, Sephardic Jewry accepted upon themselves the cherem of Rabbeinu Gershom against polygamy, in order to help unify the country. But God willing, next week, I'd like to spend next week and the following week discussing just a couple of his enactments. The whole list of the enactments is found in the Be'er HaGola, one of the commentaries on Shulchan Aruch. We've lost the original manuscript that has the original manuscript from Rabbeinu Gershom that has the list of the takanos, but the Be'er HaGola picked up from all of the secondary sources, quoting from Rabbeinu Gershom as to what the takanos were, and he has them listed over here. So some of them, like we said before, polygamy. V'od hechrem shelo yispalo hashliach tzibor kishe machzik adam cherem. Let's say the community has a blacklist of certain individuals that have been actively ostracized from the community because of a wicked behavior that they have done. I'll give you an example, by the way, where this, I was a witness to this. I was once praying in Yeshiva University, in one of the, Yeshiva University's, one big minion factory. There's, every single day over campus, there's probably about 40 minyanim that happen. Shachris, Mincha, Mariv. You can get a Mariv at 2 o'clock in the morning. You can get a Shachris, at Nate's. You can get a Mincha every hour, every half. It's unbelievable. At least 40 minyanim a day. So I was once finishing my supper, and I was going to be going home back for Shabbos. So I was planning on davening back at home when I got home, but in the cafeteria, there was a group of men that said, let's put together a minyan. So I thought, okay, sure. So we start davening, and we're about to start davening, and the person leading davening looks at the crowd and notices someone in the crowd and says, "Sir, you have to leave. We can't start davening until you leave." So the person said, "I'm not leaving." So he said, "Well, you have to leave because you have been withholding a get from your wife for the last 15 years, and you are a Rasha. You are a wicked person. We cannot continue davening with you in the minyan. You have to leave right now." And it took him, he's recalcitrant by nature, right? So it took him, a good 5-10 minutes of putting up a stink until he left. And once he left, we started davening because Rabbeinu Gershom. Now, granted, he wasn't the shliach tzibor, right? So, but this is what the Rabbeinu Gershom says, that a person who's part of the tzibor davening that has a cherem against them, he's not allowed to be the shliach tzibor. Another one, cherem shelo laharchik adam mi ishto yoser mi yudches chadashim, that a person should not be separated from their wife for more than 18 months. You see that these are just things to help society function better. Again, the halachta b'drachav, walking in God's ways, darchei darchei noam, finding pleasantry in the Torah, helping to guide the Jewish people during a time where they were being threatened by another religion, namely Christianity at the time. There's so many. I mean, look, there's a whole list. Takana, that one is here. Where's the takana about not reading someone else's mail? Here we go. It says cherem shelo leros b'ksav chavero shelo bershusa. You're not allowed to read someone else's letter. So many different takanos, all listed over here in the Be'er HaGola. So now, these takanos was one piece of the gigantic pie of Rabbeinu Gershom's gift to the Jewish world. He has an extensive commentary on the Talmud, which it finds itself on probably like 80% of Shas is covered with the explanation of Rabbeinu Gershom, and I think he actually wrote on the entire Talmud, because even though this is, let's say this is Bava Basra, okay? So Bava Basra, you see Rabbeinu Gershom, this is the explanation of Rabbeinu Gershom on the Gemara. He explains the Gemara, he explains the Mishnah, he explains the Gemara. But sometimes you'll find, let's say like in Maseches Makos, that the last daf of Maseches Makos, Rashi, either we don't have Rashi's explanation on the last daf of Makos, we've lost it, or for whatever reason, Rashi did not complete it, but the Vilna Shas editors included in order for there to be a running commentary to explain the last page of the tractate of Makos, it says Mikan ve'elech, from here till the end of the tractate, Miperush Rabbeinu Gershom. We are pulling from the manuscript of Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom, aside for his explanation of Shas and his Haramim to help guide us in our religious society, he was a composer of beautiful piyutim, of beautiful liturgical poems and songs. He wrote many responsa. Most of what we have from Rabbeinu Gershom, aside for the piyutim, most of what we have from Rabbeinu Gershom are found in secondary sources. The primary sources are scarce and quite valuable. The ones that we do have, most of it is secondary sources, except for his explanation on the Gemara and the Piyutim, as I mentioned before. But his major, opinions, established law, letters, things like that, or his opinions really are found in secondary sources quoted by others like Tosos and Rashi, and found in Shulchan Aruch, the Mordechai, and the like. I wanted to show you an amazing video clip from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, where he talks about, the Rabbeinu Gershom, the Me'or Hagola, the light of the exile, that really set a path for Ashkenaz Jewry to flourish and take off, where he frames he frames his impact in such a beautiful way, that only the Lubavitcher Rebbe could do. So it's a short clip, but it's beautiful and very impactful.
Yeah, the order of the day. You go, Mashiach.
But as the time the Union was former was the game with after the pool, und es sind nicht auf der Welt die True, und die Frage hat auch wohl noch der Wasser, der Mann Rabbeinu Gershom kommt gleich mit dem Land. Und ich verdient dass die Tor Tachtakon ist, was ich eine verbunden mit Rabbeinu Gershom. Aber dort redet Takon ist, was nicht nur zu einer Rolle gebracht ist, und von Norden, und in Misri. Reich, Rabbi, dass ich eine Furcht mache, was wissen nicht alle Protein zu suchen. Und doch ist die zweite Konnis nur Rabbeinu Gershom, aber nicht Konnis nicht gar nicht sein. Ich die Balkoche und die Balkoche und die zweite Konnis haben Konnis lernen, die nicht das Stiche Schnee auch
So just because at the beginning was a little cut off, so Lubavitcher Rebbe is just giving context to the fact that the Me'or Hagola, this light onto the nation, Rabbeinu Gershom, two of his most famous enactments were these two we were just discussing before, that it's forbidden to engage in polygamy, of having more than one wife, and you're not allowed to divorce your wife against her will.
Die ganze Geber, die Juden befinden sich in Gottes. In Gottes Dienst und in Gottes Gefängnis, was ihn gemacht hat, kommt. Aber der Ewigste Zornig mit Gabi sein nicht, hat geschossen. Da Korfol, und das kann sicher eine Sache, die der alte Rebbe sagt, nicht Korn und nicht Will. Weil man nicht nur der Kurs, der Leben hat der Ewigste in Leben. Und die zweite Sache, viele Sorgen, aber es lernen an nicht geschehen, aber ich finde noch, was gesagt hat, wenn die Gershom weiß, das ist doch ein in Hawaii Israel. Aber die Leitner, so sagen, als Volk, oder Herr, bringt Luft der Schäfe, das größte Harmonie mit der größten Support. Und als gesagt, dass muss sollen und nicht sollen, und selbst die Tür hat alles. Was eine höchsten sollen, macht oder sie, wie direkt frei. Oder die Gershom, wo Rabbeinu gesagt hat, all Korke kann nicht sein, die Gershom, die Separation. Das ist nicht, wie viel Aschid, der Lehrer muss es werden schon. Den nicht mehr ist, den als kurzen Brief und Knettes Israel und Nein Israel, soll machen, in der Wahl soll sagen, dass die Morgen mit als Support, bringt den Mittag von der Kauf, das ist wohl nicht in der Haus, wenig, und da geben noch und noch, mit der Armee, als Bischof, als Kober.
Comparing the decrees of Rabbeinu Gershom to the promises that God makes to us as his people. Rabbeinu Gershom is the more Hagola in the way that he established the way that a marriage is supposed to be, that it's not supposed to be one spouse pinned against the other spouse that has the upper hand to say, I'm going to always have this against you, that I could always get rid of you and go find someone else. No, the way we are with God is the same way. That God can never divorce us against our will, and we will never allow him, because ultimately we are his people. We are the Am HaNivchar. And secondly, that there's no such thing as there being more than one Am HaNivchar. There is only one Am HaNivchar. There's only one chosen nation. God does not, quote unquote, engage in polygamy. God has chosen us as his people. And this, says the Lubavitch Rebbe, was part of what made the Rabbeinu Gershom the Me'or Hagola, that he taught us this lesson of that you got to be in it, that there is no such thing as just dumping and going and finding the next thing. And maybe something like that might have existed in biblical times, but that is not the way that the world can be anymore. And this is, so we're talking about, more than 1,000 years ago. Rabbeinu Gershom's teachings and enactments are established today, are still in effect today. I want to show you the Ramah, that the Ramah says that even though there was potentially an expiration date to these Charamim, Rabbeinu Gershom wanted it to just last for a certain period of time. We're going to talk about that more in depth, but says the Ramah, he says, Aval min hastam nog b'chol makom, that it's been accepted completely, and he says, continues, he says, in our society, it stays exactly where it is. We have followed Rabbeinu Gershom all the way, and we are still completely indebted and connected to him. So this is just giving us a little bit of a framework of the biography of Rabbeinu Gershom, who he was, what he gave to us. God willing, next week we'll discuss the laws pertaining to reading another person's mail. This comes up in many different factors. Probably one of the most classic ones is you in an office setting, a person will get a fax, right? So you see a fax sitting on a desk, right? So presumably, according to Rabbeinu Gershom, it would seem as though you have to close your eyes like this. Of course, reading other people's emails, reading people's text messages. These things were just, the more communication that there is in the world today, the more that this institution from Rabbeinu Gershom has become more and more important. We're going to talk about that, God willing, next week. For now, we will stop here. I'm happy to hang on for a couple minutes if anyone has any questions. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Could you explain